This week, Koom and Mike discuss Alan Moore and Oscar Zarate's underappreciated 1991 work, A Small Killing, as well as a short discussion of Moore's prose novel, Jerusalem. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
Hi, this is Koom for Deconstructing Comics in Toronto with
Mike from Washington, D.C.
And Mike, this is actually the first time we're talking to each other in real time.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, we met because I bought a Alan Moore Supreme page, penciled by Chris Buss, from you, and we found that we had a real love for the history and the ins and outs of Alan Moore, and you had written extensively about a certain period. If you want to talk about that?
Sure, absolutely. So, yeah, my period of expertise is really the awesome period when he was working for Rob Liefeld, working on Supreme, and then revamping the whole Extreme universe, creating, the new version of Youngblood, working on Glory. He had some proposals, and when that all went kaput, he moved on to ABC, which is when people really sort of realized that he was doing fun superheroes again and really got interested in them again. And there was this period before that, because it's fallen out of print, because of a lot of different reasons, it's not widely read, it's not widely known. And so my area of expertise is really digging that up and putting it on my blog and trying to get people interested in it again.
Yeah, that's cool. For me, it was maybe the smaller stuff around that time that he was doing that was a bit more interesting, maybe just before he joined Liefeld and before he joined Image, and we're going to discuss one of them, A Small Killing, and we found out that we both really like this book, although maybe other people don't regard it as much of a... Yeah, we're thinking of one particular person, but maybe just in general, too, we feel that it doesn't get the due it deserves. How did you first discover this book and read it?
There was a period, so I started picking up more in real time around 95, 96, somewhere around there is when I really started picking it up. And I had just read Watchmen, I had just read V for Vendetta, I was buying Supreme when it came out.
Were you buying superhero comics before then? Were you a long-time comic collector?
I had actually stopped for a long time and had wandered into a comic book store and was looking for something different, and was looking around at the shelves and saw V for Vendetta, which looked like nothing else I had ever seen before. And I flipped it over the back, and it said, this is a comic that you've never read before. It's not like anything you've ever read before. And that was sort of my entry point into Alan Moore. And V for Vendetta is one of my favorites. I think it's his most political book, but it's meaningful to him in a strong way, and it became meaningful to me in a strong way. And from there, I just picked up everything I could find on him, and one of the things that I picked up was A Small Killing.
Yeah, that was my favorite book when I was in high school, and I discovered Moore, and that was my favorite book for a long time. And I've told you a little bit about my art woes regarding that book, but it's funny how Moore has disowned that period of work in his life, mostly because it has just bad associations, and I can understand it. And it's that book itself has had little bad associations for me, even though I loved it so much. So I kind of, maybe not just for that reason, but partly for that reason, I kind of broke away my heart a little bit, and and From Hell became my favorite work. And now From Hell's kind of being rediscovered as this great book, which it wasn't at the time. So to me, A Small Killing is kind of part of that genesis that kind of brings forth the other stuff. But then I was thinking about this in preparation for the podcast, and I always thought of the From Hell and The Small Killing and Voice of the Fire as this new direction for Moore after he breaks away from DC. But now that I think about it, V for Vendetta has elements in it that fit into this tradition of Moore's writing. And the Bo Jeffrey saga has elements in it. And I'm talking about that working class British life kind of thing that's very much rooted in his own experience growing up and living in Northampton.
Well, and absolutely, and I think it's kind of telling, and we'll probably get to this in A Small Killing when we get to discussing some of it, is Moore made a conscious decision to stay in Northampton. You know, when he became big with DC, he was on the top of the world. He could have gone anywhere, but he wanted to stay in Northampton. Northampton is very close to his heart. His past is very close to his heart. I think that's telling, and I think you can see a straight through line through all of his work about the importance of place, and especially of Northampton, to him and in his work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should just say I grew up in Leeds, England, which is not really like Northampton, except in that a lot of smaller towns that aren't London basically are kind of similar in a certain sense. So whenever I read this kind of material, the kind of rhythm that Moore infuses in these like depictions of, you know, life between the terraces, it totally relates to me. And so for me, there was like this whole other level of discovering this thrust of Moore's writing beyond the superhero stuff, which had really spoken to me in many ways, that I just continuously relate to. And hopefully, before this discussion is over, we'll get to discuss Jerusalem a little bit too, because that kind of brings it all the way back, kind of full circle, right, for more birth, life, death, and everything in between, kind of. Yeah, but
exactly. So, well, before we start talking about what we're going to talk about, maybe we should talk about A Small Killing.
Yeah, did you? Now, I know that you extensively prepared for this compared to me, and I think this is going to be interesting because I think in some ways, though we have many things in common, I think we're different in that I tend to wing things, whereas you're very meticulously prepared and you like to draw connections. So did you already have a kind of synopsis rehearsed for A Small Killing?
I didn't. I was going to go ahead and talk it through with you, if that's okay. And
yeah, totally.
There are a number of points that come up that I have questions about, and I kind of want to see what you thought about and what themes or metaphors or symbolism that you thought he was working on. We should probably warn the listeners right now that we are going to spoil the heck out of this book.
Yes.
So if you haven't read it, maybe go read it first and then come back.
I've always been of the philosophy that spoilers are good in anticipation of a good work. If it's if it's a work that just hinges on a twist or whatever, yes, spoiling it ruins its pleasure. But a good work of literature, film, drama, anything benefits from like discussing what's good about it, because you're still going to have the experience of watching it unfold, and if it's good, it's going to affect you regardless of. That's my opinion, but.
Okay, well, let's start digging in then. So this is a work that works both backwards and forwards. It's kind of the Memento timeline to it, where we start in New York. It has the subhead of 1985 to 1989, which will make sense in that our lead character, a guy by the name of Timothy Hawley, though it's spelled Hole, and I think there's some strong symbolism right there,
Absolutely.
lived in New York from 1985 to 1989, working for a major advertising company.
Is he working for the advertising company or for Flight, which I'm guessing is an analog of Coca-Cola? Because he always says, I'm working for Flight. He never says I'm working for such and such, whereas his previous job, he always calls it Macaulay Forbes, like it has a name.
That's true.
So
That's a good question.
I just assumed he was just working for the soft drink, and then he would have different accounts depending upon a new advertising cycle or whatever.
Yeah, see, I always took it the sort of the Mad Men method, which is he works for an advertising company and they land the big account. So they land Flight in the past, and now Flight is expanding into, at this point, it's Russia. The Soviet Union has just collapsed. Flight is going into Russia, and he lands the Flight account for Russia.
Actually, now that you say that, I think you're right, because the party starts off, it doesn't begin right at the party, but he's on airplane watching the washroom, and then it segs into his memory of the party last night, and it's sort of people from work, and we get the feeling that it is an advertising firm, not, the flight company itself.
Yeah, and at that party, he's talking to an older gentleman who I assumed is his boss, sort of the analog for the boss that he had in London, because the two parties are very similar to each other. So, yeah, after we get that little airplane framing device, we get into this party, and one of the interesting things that happens is at these parties and in various places, you hear these voices in the background, which I thought was a really interesting device, was a nice device to sort of give you a feel of these locations, because we move from location to location to location throughout the book, and the voices change as we move from location to location. And one of the things that really struck me as funny was in the New York party scene, you keep hearing this sound effect of a voice saying, because it's the 1980s in New York and they're probably enjoying some nose candy.
Yeah, good point. Good point. I remember lending this book back to somebody in the 90s, and she said she'd never seen that kind of conversation in the background before. And then when I thought about it, I was like, yeah, this book really uses that as a tone, like as a stylistic device. That's partly what makes this book kind of feel very different from any other Alan Moore book, although it feels similar to other Alan Moore books as well. And that constant noise or hubbub in the background sort of disengages Tim from everybody else, because he's constantly in this swirl or babble of voices and yet not really connecting with any one particular person. So it doesn't have this kind of grounded, linear feel, right? It has a dream feel, which is set up by that. Anyway, continue.
Well, exactly. And you bring up a good point, which is I don't think this feels like a normal Alan Moore book. There's a number of reasons why. I was reading this point online as I was doing some research for this. If you think about it, what are the graphic novels that Moore has done? Sort of, if you take a strict definition of he wrote this solely to be one book, didn't serialize it, didn't put out individual comics that were collected later, there really aren't that many in his bibliography to draw from. This is one that he knew he was doing a single version, a single book, a single artist working on it, and he knew it was going to be packaged as one thing, and they didn't serialize the sort of chapters in it.
Yeah, well, it was at that juncture after Watchmen when they really were trying to make, comics as like close to literature as possible, I think, or something like that. And so Victor Gallant had approached Moore, and he was supposed to do 3 of these, I believe. And so it was part of that flush that I think also produced big numbers. But the only time that somebody who was not really strictly a comics person approached him was, I think, Victor Gallant, because didn't Gallant also release Voice of the Fire, or am I wrong about that?
I think you're right, because they were a book publisher and they were moving into sort of graphic novels to try and, as you said, it was the flavor of the month, and they thought graphic novels were going to be the new literature, and unfortunately after the early 90s it sort of all fell apart. Yeah,
no, just to answer your question about other just pure graphic novels, what else would you put in that category? The Killing Joke? Is there anything else?
Maybe, but The Killing Joke is about 40 pages. I mean, it really is kind of an annual, more than...
I guess you could say that, except Moore kind of treats it like... I mean, you could sell that today if you were producing it as a graphic novel, I think. Like today, you could say, I've got 40 pages of really tight, introspective work there.
Well, so A Killing Joke, and perhaps the 49ers, if you remember his ABC work, that was the only one that sort of came out as a standalone work.
I thought the 49ers was in 2 parts. Or something like
no, the 49ers came out in one part, I believe it came out in hardcover first. It reads, if you read it, it reads like it's going to be different chapters, because most of Moore's work is like that, where it's divided up into books, into chapters.
Including A Small Killing.
Exactly, including a small killing. So, yeah, but I thought that was an interesting note that somebody had put up, and so wanted to mention it. And then, of course, the other thing that strikes...
Well, then if you're saying the 49ers, we have to say the Black Dossier, too. That was released as one.
Oh, yes, that's right. I forgot about the Black Dossier. So there are a few of them out there, whether intentionally or unintentionally became graphic novels.
Yeah,
so
I would say unintentionally. It would be what I'd say. Hey, go on.
So I was going to say the other thing that really separates this apart is, of course, the work of the artist on this. Oscar Zarate, his work is unlike much of anything that anyone would have seen from an Alan Moore book up to this point.
Especially because it's in color. Because he worked on the Jack the Ripper epilogue, right, with Moore, and that seems more of a kind with Moore's more indie kind of odd things. But this, just the glorious color, it's just so 80s, like in its kind of use of pastel and pencil crayon and, that sheen. Anyway, I keep cutting you off, so just jump right back in.
No, it's fine. The other thing about it that I think, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, is it feels very European. Up into the 80s, the big graphic novels were Watchmen, were Dark Knight Returns. It was very superhero. It was very colored in a certain way. Art was a certain way. It was drawn from, the Jack Kirby style, bringing it forward, superheroes, all of that. And this doesn't look anything like that. This really has that indie feel, but it also, with the color, with the style, with the large pages, really has a European feel to it that, again, up until this point in Alan Moore's work, is unlike anything they've seen before.
Right. Although, to me, it is very similar, despite the color, with Big Numbers, and I'm just looking in my Alan Moore Storyteller, as you instructed me to do. Small Killing comes out in 1991. Big Numbers comes out, do you remember? Is it 92 or?
I have it right here. Hold on.
So Big Numbers in 1990. So Big Numbers does precede this.
Yeah, but they had approached, so Alan Moore had approached Oscar when ARG was coming out in 1988, was approached Oscar, and Oscar actually approached him and said, I have this idea if you're interested in doing something of a man being followed by a child.
Yes.
And Moore instantly jumped on it.
Yes.
He wanted to do something completely different from Watchmen. He wanted to move away from superheroes. He wanted to do something with real people, and he grabbed onto the idea and ran with it. So it's all of the same time. It's Lost Girls, Big Numbers, From Hell. All of it is coming after this break with DC, after Watchmen, after A Killing Joke, after V for Vendetta finished up.
Yes, absolutely. Anyway, so we should get into some of the themes, and let's just do a quick synopsis of the story.
Okay, yes. So we start off in New York. Timothy has gotten this new contract to sell Flight the soda in Russia, and he's trying to figure out how to do it. He's going to take a small holiday before he moves on to the campaign, and he's decided to go back and visit his folks back in England. So we start in New York, and he's thinking about it, and he has this dream of this man and this little kid, and he doesn't know what's going on. He's far away. They're fighting. Something's going on, maybe they're hugging, and then lightning strikes, and he wakes up. In real life, he's also starting to see a little boy following him around, about 10 years old, and he's not sure what's going on. At one point, the little boy turns up in the middle of the road and forces his car to drive off and nearly kill him. And he starts to get very concerned about this little kid, and he thinks maybe this little kid is trying to kill him. So you talked before about how he ended up on this plane and how he's looking at the bathroom, and he thinks the little kid is in the bathroom. He thinks the little kid is following him all the way to England. So next, the second chapter is in London, and now he's in London, and he's going back through some of his memories. He's remembering that he used to work for an advertising agency in London that was smaller than where he's working now, and he felt like he was sort of supporting them. He was their main guy, and he wanted to get out and go to America.
Although there are hints that are suggesting that rather he continuously reforms reality. He uses cognitive dissonance to look at things as if like he's supporting them, whereas like when he originally gets hired, he's kind of being done a favor by the owner of the agency, and then later on Timothy abandons him once he becomes successful. It just reminded me, I'm not a big Sandman fan, but one of the very earliest stories I read when in high school was the one about the writer who wants to be really successful, and then he has Calliope locked up, and then basically rapes her, abuses her, and then his career ascends, and then he immediately just leaves his agent for like a bigger agent. And those scenes just to me just were so similar because they so clearly criticize this kind of character move, you know, this kind of ambition, this kind of disregard for human kindness, because we get the sense that his boss in London was actually a fairly kind person who was a human person and a decent person, and Timothy just abandoned him when it was convenient.
Well, absolutely. And I read it a little differently. I read it as though the book to me is all about lying. The book to me is about Timothy as an advertising man sort of being a liar. And so we start off with him in New York, and what he remembers is the lies, and the lies have become true to him. And as he moves backwards in time, as he moves back through London and then back to his hometown, the lies sort of get forgotten and we start to see the truth. And I think to him, maybe he's starting to see the truth too as he's moving backwards. And maybe he didn't know that he was lying that whole time. Maybe he did. It's difficult to say. But yeah, so the interesting thing is you mentioned how it works with the advertising company, but it's a similar thing is happening with his personal relationships too. When we start off in New York, he's talking about the woman who destroyed his marriage and how terrible she was. But don't worry, because he still likes women and he's a really nice guy. But as we go back, we see she didn't destroy his marriage. He destroyed his marriage. We see that she wasn't a terrible person. He was the terrible person, that she wasn't making the decisions. He wasn't able to make the decisions, which forced her hand. And so it's interesting to see how the two stories, those sort of two parallel threads of both his career and his personal life going backwards are filled with lies and self-delusions that he's told himself.
Yes, absolutely. So to me, I saw the advertising period in London as sort of exactly the same, just another parallel. Just like the lie he tells his wife when he proposes to her. But we should get there. So then it moves from London to...
Well, before we get there, let's mention one thing, because he sees the boy again in London, and the boy forces him to, or leads him into a full-scale riot. And the riot breaks out in a pub. The police show up, you know, jackbooted uniforms, and start beating on the people. And Timothy starts to realize, you know what, this kid is really trying to get me killed.
And the kid even admits it when he confronts the kid.
That's right. So he heads back to Sheffield. And so Sheffield is the town, the city where Timothy is from. And he heads back there to go spend time with his parents. And while he's back there, he sees the kid again, and they go into a pub. He orders the kid a soda. He drinks a beer, and the kid comes out and tells him, "I'm trying to kill you."
Yeah.
Yeah. So meanwhile, we're also, as we're in Sheffield, we're getting...
Now, we should say that we've got no evidence throughout the book that anybody else ever sees this kid that Timothy continues to see. And just a minor point, but throughout this time, while he's thinking about the kid, while he's coming up with all of these theories as to what the kid's doing and like whether he's being paid by a rival advertising company to make Timothy look paranoid or destabilize him or whatever, he's trying to figure out how to creatively approach this big pressure ad that he's got to create for flight, and he's continuously blocked because he can't think of the right angle or the right idea. So that's another thread that's like running through as well. Anyway, so we go to Sheffield.
It wouldn't be more if there weren't several threads going on quite all at the same time.
All skillfully woven together.
Exactly. So we go back, we see Timothy with his parents, and we get a nice little flashback of him proposing to his wife. And his wife, before she says yes, asks him, what's the worst thing you've ever done? And he says that when he was 10, he bottled up a bunch of insects and buried the bottle to kill them and ran home. But halfway home, he decided his conscience got the better of him. He turned around, freed the bugs, and then went home and got in trouble with his mom. And his then fiance, wife, whatever, decides that, yes, this is a good man, I'll marry him. And they do. And we see through the book that ultimately the marriage fails. He has an affair. The affair fails. And that he's kind of a failure. And it's sort of all built upon this one story. So he goes back, he's hanging out at his parents' house, and he happens to flip through a photo album. And going back through the photos, he sees himself as a 10-year-old boy, and it's the same boy. He realizes the 10-year-old version of him is trying to kill him. So then we get to the fourth and final chapter, which is called The Old Buildings. I forget, in Jerusalem, what does he call the buildings, the flats?
They're called New Life, I want to say.
I mean the old buildings that the old houses that people used to live in, the row houses in
terraces.
Northampton. Yeah, the terraces. So they're called the terraces in Jerusalem. Here they're called the old buildings. They're where he lived until he was about 10 years old, that his parents moved him out. And this is the fourth chapter, and it's almost like a dream. It's almost like he's being haunted.
Sorry, did you mean the boroughs? Did you mean the neighborhood?
Yeah, that's what I mean. I'm sorry, I meant the boroughs.
Yeah, terraces are just those row houses or council houses that people who weren't middle class, or sometimes people who were middle class had row houses, have row houses as well. But they're usually a certain area. They're usually like council places where you rent, and the local council maintains them, but there's usually all kinds of problems. Anyway, continue, please.
Sure. So he is bicycling now through these row houses, through this old area where he used to live, and he happens to run into his ex-wife, who's now happily remarried, has kids, and her life ended up fine, but his is kind of a mess. So he's wondering, am I dead? He goes back and he happens upon the place where he buried the bugs, and he starts to think back, and he realizes, no, that was a lie. He never went back and dug up the bugs. He left them buried to die. He ran home so he wouldn't get in trouble. He had his dinner, and he just moved on with his life. And so he goes back and he goes to dig up the bugs, and the bottle is huge and glowing, and he opens it, and gigantic insects come roaring out. They've been alive this whole time and mutated into something terrible and horrible.
And the jar itself grows huge before he opens it.
Yeah. It's a beautiful picture that Oscar had drawn for that. I think it's a glorious, one of the best images in the book.
It is. It's really powerful. Also, just even right after, when the insects are slithering over him, it's just phantasmagoric. It's, you can really feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so after the insects get out, the little boy is there, and he says, I'm sorry, I realized that I lied all this time. It's all my fault. I'm sorry. And the kid doesn't want to hear anything about it and starts attacking him. And
he says, why are you doing this? Or why do you want to kill me? And the kid says, because you killed me first. And I have a question about the kid. See, I think I thought the first time I read it that it was his 10-year-old self because he looks identical to the photo. But when he says "you kill me first," we sort of skipped over this a bit, but in the flashback with Sylvia, the artist woman that he cheated on his wife with. She's an artist living in London that he meets through his boss when he's working in London. When they have a baby eventually, after he's left his wife, and she says, "I'm pregnant, what do you want to do?" You kind of mentioned, he says, "Well, it's your decision." He won't make a decision, so he just kind of withdraws. He doesn't engage with her. He's kind of closed off, and he does that thing, which I think Moore continually criticizes him for, by showing him being kind of hypocritical, like what he says is not really what he feels or what have you. And then so she ends up having an abortion and then sending him the abortion in a test tube, which I don't know if that's really possible. Like she'd, I don't think if you go to a clinic, you can keep the aborted fetus, or if you do it yourself, I don't know that you'd be able to skillfully. Anyway, but it is an amazingly strong moment in the book. And then so I just wondered sometimes when this kid says, "You kill me first," is it supposed to be the phantom or the phantasm of the aborted fetus having grown up, and it just happens to look identical to him to indicate that it's his, progeny?
Well, there's another theory that you could go there too, which is, how do we know that was the aborted fetus that she sent to him? She could have just sent that as a ruse and had the child.
No, fair enough, and that would explain how she could have done it, but we're supposed to understand that he understands it as the aborted fetus.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, or a thing for me that I took from it was, and Oscar sort of mentioned this in one of his interviews later, it doesn't really matter who the kid is. There's a number of times through the book that I think on first read you're supposed to wonder who the kid is. Is it his kid through someone else? Is it another kid? Is it a midget killer? Is it all of these different things? And ultimately, I don't think it matters who the kid is. What matters is that Timothy recognizes it as his younger self, as, this is kind of a cliched idea, but as his innocence that he killed.
And but then, if that is true, why then wouldn't he be older? I mean, despite the fact that Oscar had this idea about a man and a little boy, and Moore had to work with it. But he's sort of innocent throughout youth, throughout adolescence, because he has all these socialist values and hippie values. He and Maggie do, and it's once he takes the job in London with the advertising firm, once he kind of goes down that path where he becomes a total yuppie, that kind of lifestyle choice and ideological choice that Moore criticizes, that he sells out those values. He doesn't sell them out when he's 10, unless we look at the event of him burying the Halliburton bottle with the insects as him sort of selling out. Like he was like an innocent kid up until then, and he was like essentially a good kid, and at that moment he changed, which I don't think there's enough support in the book for that, but I don't know, you could make that argument.
I think that's sort of the argument that I make, is that first lie that you make, that first lie to yourself about who you are as a person, ultimately, or I think the book is arguing, leads to all the lies that you ultimately make about yourself and who you are and what your actions are, and what, maybe your actions weren't as bad as they probably were. So I think it's the start of that. I think he would have been someone very different. Would he still have the idealistic viewpoints? Probably, but you'll notice he had those idealistic viewpoints, but he's still lying to his fiancée.
Yes.
Either you are a good person or you're not.
Yeah.
In absolute terms. Let me just toss this in because I can't help it. I did the research. So back in the 80s, Moore wrote this series called Night Raven, and there's a little line in here that I really liked, and it's always stuck with me. And it's interesting that in A Small Killing, it's a 10-year-old boy, because in Night Raven they talked about a 10-year-old boy. And here it is. He had a son called Alex who would reach his 10th birthday sometime later in this year of our Lord, 1973. 10 was a good age, maybe the last good age. It was the age when parents stopped worrying about what other people might do to their kids, given the chance, and start worrying about what their kids might do to themselves.
That's great.
I think more focuses on 10 years old as that age where you stop being a kid and you start becoming someone who could do evil, who could lie, who could become someone else. And that's sort of the point of demarcation. And I think that's why it's this kid at 10 years old in a small killing as the line of demarcation for that first lie is where he ultimately becomes this advertising yuppie versus who else he might have become.
Yes. I'll just also throw in that Moore has talked about advertising as sort of a misuse of the magic of language, especially in The Mindscape of Alan Moore, where he talks about how language, has the potential to weave charms and stuff. He says nowadays it's just being used by advertising, which is just a complete, he doesn't use the word abomination, but a kind of abomination of that power and so on. So to me, like Timothy Hole or Hole, because he's sort of a vacuous hole, is a embodiment of that Moore was kind of like recognizing pretty early on.
And there's the metaphor for that beyond just his name.
There's the hole that he fights the kid in, which is where we are in the book, right?
Right, and there's also the eggs, the empty eggs that he had made a display of and kept from when he was about 11 years old.
Except they're not really empty, because one of the eggs breaks and the blood splatters on his feet, like in the party. If you look, did you see that onto his shoes?
No, I didn't notice it.
Okay, I'm gonna alert you to that, just because I want to make sure I'm reading it right. If you take a look at the page where it shatters, right? Last panel. Look at those shoes. Don't they have blood on them, or are they just painted red? I wasn't sure, but
I thought they were painted red. It looks like, the sort of brown or red and white alternating shoes. But I like your theory though.
Yeah, then maybe I'm wrong, because there's no blood on the floor at all. So maybe the eggs are completely empty. But yeah, I mean, to me the eggs have a different. Well, let's get into that in a second. Let's finish the synopsis. So he's found the Halibrange bottle. Like, to me, this is all a dream. Like, I don't know if you believe that the kid could be real, because you talked about these multiple possibilities. But to me, the fact that nobody else ever sees the kid, the fact that he's dressed in sort of like post World War II-esque wear, which can't be right given the era that Timothy Hole was 10 years old, and I'm just going to call him Timothy Hole because I feel like
it's more fun that way.
It's Timothy Hole. But anyway, to me, he's not real, except he fights him, and then the thunder comes down like in his dream, and ends up killing the kid, or he ends up killing the kid with a shard from the Halibrange bottle, and then when he wakes up in the hole the next day, there's a shard there. So I don't know, like, it's like Zarate or Moore is like trying to say, oh my God, it could actually be real. Did you notice the shard?
I did notice the shard, and you probably also noticed when he was in the bar drinking and talking to the kid, he orders the soda and the beer, and he drinks the beer, and when he leaves, the beer is empty, but the soda is completely full. The kid hasn't touch the soda. So was there anyone there who was supposed to have drunk the soda?
Yeah, besides Timothy himself, right? I mean, there's a very strong indication in the bar that they don't see the kid, to me. I mean, like, the way they talk to him, they're like, keep it down, as if he's kind of a crazy person.
Right.
They don't kind of say to the kid, is this man bothering you or anything like that? I don't know. But, so basically it ends up with Timothy surviving, which I find kind of an odd ending, given that Timothy is sort of being somebody we despise, or at least we pity in a non-empathetic way throughout the book, and then he ends up kind of surviving by beating the kid, you know.
But did he? See, I took it as it probably was not a physical fight. It was probably a fight for his soul.
Sure. But once again, the kid to some degree represents, you know, the bad things that he did, and so we're sort of like, at least I am, more on the side of the kid than on his side at the end.
I think that the kid won. So throughout the entire book, there's been this symbol of the glasses that he wears. When he wears the glasses, he doesn't see right. He doesn't see the world as it actually is. It's all these lies, but compounded on lies of what he's told himself, and so he believes it to be true. And the times when he takes off his glasses, when his eyes are open, if you go through and read the book, keeping careful look of when he has his eyes open, when he has the glasses off, that's when he's at his most perceptive. That's when we see the most amount of truth. And after the fight with the little kid, when he gets up and leaves, he leaves the glasses behind.
Oh, that's very good. Yes, I see what you're saying.
So in my theory is the little boy won. The older Timothy his soul was killed. The boy moved back into the adult body. He goes. He orders a soda, but purposefully not a flight. He gets a newspaper that has situations vacant, which I assume is want ads. So he's looking for a new job. And he heads out into the morning, and he's no longer thinking about flight. He's no longer thinking about advertising. He's no longer thinking about any of these things. He's not wearing his glasses. He's wearing this brown sweater that, you know, could be a working man's sweater to get him back into the socialist frame of mind that he was in before. I think
that's very good. That's a very strong reading. I missed the situations vacant thing because I've never come across that particular phrasing before.
No, nor have I.
Yes, but for this to work, he'd have to pretty much decide to like stay in Sheffield because that would just be local jobs. So he's not going back to London at all. He's completely making a break from his life.
Exactly, and it's a new dawn. In fact, it says the last line is "Into the morning, unnoticed, I slipped from the scene of the crime." So that to me suggests that like something bad has happened, but I guess it's not, I don't know. Well, it's bad and it's good. Actually, this brings up an interesting point. So we were talking about this before, where I had talked to someone that I was going to be doing this podcast and reading A Small Killing, and they mentioned that they really didn't like A Small Killing, besides the fact that there's so much symbolism in here that you have to sort of read into. There's also, Timothy is completely unlikable. He's a terrible human being. There's not much that's likable about him. Yet not a type that is uncommon for Moore. I feel like I've seen this kind of critique of humanity before in characters. I'm thinking of one particular short story that he wrote in Dodgem Logic around Christmas time, and I can't remember the title or even much about what happens in the story, except that the guy continuously lies to himself, and it's told from first person. But go on. He's unlikable and... Well, and so I was wondering, we talked before about how A Small Killing is sort of slipped through the cracks. It's not one that sort of comes up a whole lot, especially amongst Moore fans or certainly non-Moore fans. Do you think Big Numbers has slipped through the cracks less? Do you think Big Numbers is known and read by Moore fans more? I do at this point. I think it's read more, not because it's more easily obtainable, but because it has that feel of being Moore's white whale, that thing that he couldn't conquer. And so people want to read it. They want to know what was going. It had such a great, big idea to it that I think strong Moore fans want to know about it. They want to read it. They want to talk about it. There's more to talk about. Yes. A Small Killing is difficult. It's hard to grasp. It's hard to put your head around, and it's hard to like. It's a hard book to love. It's a book about a man having a midlife crisis. That's not something that's
I don't find
easily...
that at all. I find it so easy to read. It all hangs together so tightly, kind of like The Killing Joke. It's very digestible, and you can connect the dots very easily. It's all very, very, very carefully structured and very tightly written, even though it has kind of a loose European feel, like you said. Whereas I think Big Numbers is more sprawling, it has various characters, although the similarity is that you have a number of characters who are sort of salt of the earth people, and sort of those Burroughs types, like you said, and then you have these characters who are like slick advertising or commercial types who are coming in to build the mall, and sort of like you can see that there's a kind of a conflict coming down the road that Moore never actually got to publish, but it's sort of like A Small Killing, except in A Small Killing those worlds are separated as he goes further into his past, and he goes further into small town England, then he gets more rooted into like an authentic kind of vernal, innocent pastoral kind of thing, whereas in Big Numbers, it's all kind of smooshed together, depending upon where you go into town and the story.
No, that's very true.
But well, go on.
Well, one of the things that we were talking about is how A Small Killing sort of fits right there with Big Numbers, with From Hell, from Lost Girls, about all these work that he's doing, after the break from DC. And one of the readings, it's hard for me to read A Small Killing without just immediately jumping into this is an autobiography of Alan Moore. So,
why do you feel that, though? I mean, I think to some degree Timothy's parents sort of reflect his depictions of his own parents that kind of crop up. And it's something I always envy, that kind of picture of domesticity in parents, because my parents are nothing like that. And my home life is nothing like that. So that kind of cozy warmth and safety and reliability that's there in the midst of poverty and hardship is something that, and the mom's not called Sylvia, but the woman Timothy has an affair with is called Sylvia, and Sylvia was his mom's name. So,
and think of it this way. So the 4 chapters are given years. So the New York years are between 1985 and 1989. 1985 is when Alan Moore started writing Swamp Thing for DC.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant, Mike. Yes, I see where you're going.
So the London chapter is from 1979 to 1985. It completely corresponds to the time when Alan Moore started writing comics in the British scene.
And it also corresponds to Warrior, right, which kind of ended that period not on a great note.
Well, and here's the thing. So this is something that struck me, and there's a whole thread of this. So in the New York section, he says, New York was a peculiar mood that I had to fly out of, or I flew out of. And whenever Moore writes the word mood, it strikes me as another quote that he talked about, which is post-Watchmen, The Killing Joke. He writes about the apocalyptic bleakness of comics over the past 15 years sometimes seems odd to me because it's like that was a bad mood that I was in 15 years ago. It was the 1980s. We got this insane right-wing voter fear running through the country, and I was in a bad mood politically and socially and in most other ways, so that tended to reflect in my work. But it was a genuine bad mood, and it was mine. I tend to think that I've seen a lot of it over the past 15 years that have been a bizarre echo of somebody else's bad mood. It's not even their bad mood, it's mine. But they're still working out the ramifications of me being a bit grumpy 15 years ago.
So when did he say this? Can you give me
This was in about 2000 when he was launching ABC, when he was talking about he was in a much more optimistic frame of mind, and how at the end of DC, I mean, if you look at it, The Killing Joke, Watchmen, and especially the Twilight of the superhero's proposal.
Yeah.
They're very bleak. They're terribly nihilistic.
But it also feels like Moore has to do that because that's the fashion that he's created. And so he has to, imagine like you're Giorgio Armani, and then suddenly, you want to throw like wild colors and like daisies on your suits and stuff. You're not going to do that. You created a very particular kind of style. But I cut you off once again when you were about to finish the quote. Do you want to?
Well, no, no, that's the end of the quote. But absolutely, and that's why when he took the break from DC, he saw it as a real opportunity to turn away from what he was doing, from that peculiar mood that he had been in, from this apocalyptic mood that he had been in, to something much more positive, to something more grounded and humanistic, to something much more local to what he was doing.
But From Hell isn't like that, and Lost Girls isn't like that. So there was still a real mix of, like, there's an essence of Moore that's rooted in the horror and violence. He really likes grinding the gears of life. And that's partly what I love about him.
Well, absolutely, and I don't think one person can ever change completely. It's not like he was going to suddenly start writing Snoopy comics, but there's a definite change between what he was doing at DC with superheroes. And if you look at The Killing Joke, with what he was doing to those characters, he didn't feel that those characters were solid enough that the horror was really deserved on them. It's Batman and the Joker and Batgirl. These are flimsy, two-dimensional characters that you shouldn't inflict real horror upon. From Hell are real characters, and he gives so much to those characters, and he grounds them, and he makes them three-dimensional, that the horror becomes much more important, that it becomes a sociological horror. It becomes a horror of society that works in a much better way. You can see the progression that he's made from there to From Hell, and it was a distinct change that he needed to make. And I think A Small Killing talks about his need to change from what he had been doing in the past to what he wanted to do ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you, but at the same time, I think, I mean, this is all relative because it's all how these works hit you. But when I read The Killing Joke, it hit me, and like those elements where the Joker has his flashbacks to being poor, not being able to make the bills, and making some of those choices, you could say that's as rooted in the kind of stuff that he ends up doing in From Hell and, big numbers and whatnot. I mean, those seedy kind of things, and they're there in Swamp Thing. They're there to some degree in Watchmen, although I think Watchmen is more of an artificial plastic work, if you ask me. But it's there to some degree. And, I mean, yes, we know that he was definitely trying to do that with Supreme and with ABC, like we've argued. It's just, I don't know that they hit home as much. Like, what is the stuff from the ABC stuff that's the most popular? It's The League, and The League is extremely kind of destructive and filled with pain and violence.
Very true.
And whatnot.
Well, I think you make a very good point there. However, I think for A Small Killing, it's about more state of mind at the time. He was doing ARG. He was breaking up with DC.
Yeah.
He wanted to do something different. And this, in many ways, I see A Small Killing as him documenting what he had done in the past and how he wanted to change himself. And it's a brilliant theory. If we take it back one further stage, so you talked about 1979 to 85. What about the stage before that? How does that correspond with his life? Well, the years before that, 1964 to 1979, was, if you look at it, the age Timothy is the same age as that Alan Moore was. So it was the 10 years. It was his time in school, ultimately leading
at the Northampton Arts Lab.
It's during the Northampton Art Lab. It was when he married Phyllis. It was when he got thrown out of school and had to for doing LSD and dealing LSD. And in fact, what Moore said in a later interview was that Oscar Zarate actually used the landscape of Northampton when he was drawing Sheffield, when he was drawing all that.
Ah, that's interesting, because in Big Numbers, it's called Hampton. It's obviously Northampton because that train station, I'm positive, was Northampton's train station. But he still doesn't call it Northampton until he gets to Voice of the Fire. Voice of the Fire, as far as I know, is his first acknowledged Northampton landscape.
Sure. Well, and just taking one last point about the break between comics. So if you think about the period in London when Timothy is doing the advertising in London, in the same period, Alan Moore is working on Warrior, on 2000 AD, Marvel UK. And in A Small Killing, there's this ad that he's done that's deemed absolutely brilliant. And it's this ad of this woman being chased by a pack of cars.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he says about it that Timothy says about it is that he knew exactly who his target audience was. They were young, they were single, they were white males earning between 10 and 15 grand. And that's exactly the same target for comic readers. Young, single, white males.
That's a brilliant analysis. I have nothing to say to that.
Well,
it's not the association I made, but it's brilliant. It's brilliant.
Well,
that's
and there's one more question, and I'm going to ask you this one, and I have my answer.
And I have a couple of questions for you, so remind me if I don't ask them.
I will do. Okay, so if that is his work, which work do you think he's talking about? Which comics works corresponds to that ad of young, aggressive, angry, black and white comics that was deemed brilliant and got Alan Moore noticed?
To me, if I'm going with your theory, it's not necessarily the black and white stuff. It's the later stuff for DC. Go on.
No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have interrupted. You go ahead.
It's a brilliant theory. For it to work, the British advertising firm has to correspond with the British publishers. But I think Moore always said that there just wasn't a huge market in Britain. It just kind of looked that good because they were all just giving themselves Eagle Awards and stuff like that. So, I mean, if you wanna slot it in there, I think you'd have to say it's the Warrior stuff, because the Warrior stuff is really considered the first kind of stuff that breaks the two-dimensionality of comics and brings ushers in the violence, and it wasn't really really checked by anybody. He later had fights with Deskin over using words and things, but generally I think he had a free hand in terms of the violence and the aggressiveness with which he, marshaled his ideas. Is there a particular one that you're thinking of?
There is. So, and I agree. I think it's absolutely from his Warrior period. So if we think, okay, the advertising is the stand-in for the comics. The comics that got him noticed especially were his superhero comics. So in the New York period, the DC period, he was well known for his superhero comics. And the one that really broke out. I
thought you were saying it's the British.
Yep.
It's the British. Okay.
So the one that got noticed in Warrior was Marvel Man.
Yeah.
It completely broke the mold. Everyone started talking about it. In fact, it ultimately came over and was reprinted in the United States, and he finished it here.
Yeah.
And it was such a complete change. It got him noticed by American publishers. American publishers noticed V for Vendetta. They noticed the other work, but it was his work on superheroes that really stood out as though this is somebody who can come over and work with us. I think he's making a criticism of his work in Marvel Man because it was loud and it was angry and it was brash and it was violent. And I think by 1989, 90, 91, Moore is sick of that. He wants to move away from violent, extreme superheroes. He wants to go and deal with real people.
The only thing I would say is, like, when I think of your brilliant theory and I map it onto, like, to me, just instinctively, that car ad is about the Killing Joke, because it's about basically the murder of a woman, right? And that's what the Killing Joke is, like, notorious for, is for the suggested rape and the crippling of Barbara Gordon, right? And in Marvel Man, I think he was still very, I don't know, he was very kind to Liz Moran. But the other thing, though, too, is, like, this is where it diverges from his life. In Timothy Hull's story, in A Small Killing, that ad comes out of this anger and inability to deal with the fact that his marriage is broken up and his relationship with Sylvia has broken up. And it's specifically what Sylvia does that really bothers him. But at that point in Moore's life, if you map the two timelines, he hadn't broken up with Phyllis. He was still putting out big numbers with Phyllis and Deborah. You know, so
well, exactly, and I think for for my theory to work is I don't think it's an exact track. I think it's a stand-in. It's aggressive and angry, and it's aggressive and angry at women because that tracks with what A Small Killing needed him to be aggressive and angry about.
Whereas I'm sure Moore doesn't identify with that. I think Moore's always kind of seen himself as pro-woman. Right?
Yes, I think he absolutely has, although let's not go into
let's not go there.
Let's not go there. But because I'm not sure in 90 or 91 when this came out, the hue and cry over A Killing Joke and its treatment of Batgirl had really become a thing yet. I don't think people really started to notice that until much later. And
I think at that time it was still kind of considered remarkable. It had its detractors. I remember being in high school once and going to a small con, and they only had like 2 comics cast. And then I was like waiting for to get a signature. And I can't remember who it was, but somebody ahead of me was. It was like this couple, and they were like this almost middle-aged couple, or they were not quite middle-aged. They're like typically nerdy, and the woman was like, "I don't think he should have crippled the Joker. Should have crippled, Barbara Gordon in that comic." And I was like, why is she talking to this guy? He had nothing to do with the comic. And the poor guys just sitting there like signing or sketching whatever they wanted. And he's like, well, it's just a comic, I mean, that was kind of, and I was thinking inside, like, what's wrong with this lady? Like, like I was sort of like laughing at her inside. My teenage self was kind of like laughing at her. And so I think that's what I thought of as kind of the mainstream perception that, like, oh, they're just trying new things, and it's, but yeah, Moore has severely kind of denounced that. And of course, like, the culture surrounding that story about, I think it was Julie Schwartz that said, cripple the bitch, right? When Moore asked about it, that just really points to really toxic values that we're still dealing with today in comics.
Well, absolutely.
Coming up is A Small Killing, Moore denouncing all his previous work, visual metaphors in the story, and discussion of Moore's prose novel Jerusalem and just the nature of Alan Moore. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support.
Welcome to the Superman Fan Podcast. My name is Billy Hogan, and I will be your host. Before we begin our journey through the time barrier, please ensure that your red indestructible capes are securely fastened around your necks, so that we may all travel safely into the past to explore the Silver Age adventures of the Man of Steel in the pages of Action Comics, Superman, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, and World's Finest Comics. After we return from our journey, I encourage you to go to the website, thesupermanfanpodcast.blogspot.com. I look forward to have you join me each week to explore the Silver Age adventures of the Man of Steel.
So one last thing, and that I want to sort of touch on, if it's okay, is, again, I think more, and a lot of this is probably just me reading into it, is more wanting to move away from not just superheroes, but sort of that toxic mentality that you were talking about. Because when he comes back, okay, so he goes away, he goes off and he does Big Numbers, he does From Hell and Taboo, he does Lost Girls and Taboo, and everything sort of becomes a mess. Taboo goes under, Big Numbers goes under, his marriage falls apart. He needs money. He's working on From Hell as best he can, and he returns to American superhero comics. He returned to Spawn in 1963 and 1993, so we're only talking 2 years later. And then in 1995, he does Outbreak of Violets for the MTV Europe Awards, and then in 1996, he does Supreme. And I think when he comes back, his entire thinking of how to do superhero comics has changed. And he's thinking much more optimistically. He's trying to put new values into them. And I think A Small Killing points towards that. He might not know that he's going to return to superhero comics, but when he does, he's doing it in a way that feels more innocent, that feels like he's trying to put them back together again rather than tear them apart.
Well, absolutely. I just don't know if it works.
I think A Small Killing points to that.
I just don't know if it works, because later Moore does go back to, he does gravitate towards some very dark material. We've talked about Providence. You and I have talked about that, personally, and even the ABC stuff. You know, I mean, it's like his projects are never as interesting as when the unpredictable violence erupts, whether that's in Promethea and there's various kinds of violence, and because he's drawn to apocalypse as a way of delivering a final act, that in itself kind of pulls along a certain amount of inherent violence within it, so...
the act of creation itself is violent. You have a plain white page, and you are marking it with your ideas and your thoughts. It's an inherently violent process. You're destroying something to make it. It's going from potential to it can only be this one thing. And
yes,
I think
that's a really good point.
That is part of the process, and I think that's part of his magical belief is that there has to be. Like you said, there has to be apocalyptic visions. There has to be this. You have to go through this, and as a writer, you have to create drama. You have to create conflict in order for your characters to go somewhere and become something. So I think that's inherent in his writing, but I think there's more than just what you write about. There's also how you write about it, and how you write about it changed for Alan. I think. You can see it in From Hell, where he's grappling with bigger ideas, but bigger characters and bigger societies that can handle that horror. With his superheroes, he doesn't do that anymore because he realizes superheroes aren't capable of containing that horror, that they're not strong enough characters, they're not a strong enough society for those things to do anything other than, create bad representation, I think.
Well... I would just kind of argue, and this is sort of like us discussing our book, I think, in some ways, because we were originally talking about taking opposing viewpoints when we were talking about it. But I would argue that he strengthened the capacity for those superhero titles to take that kind of violence and that kind of growth. That's why people really love that period of Moore's work so much, and nobody's ever. And I would hazard a guess that inside his heart of hearts, he would not abandon those works either.
No.
Like if, like some wizard kind of, you know, if Guntag Borhelm kind of appeared and said, you could completely just, you know, get rid of all of these works, you know, and nobody would ever know about them and they never have existed. I don't think you could quite. It's one thing to throw out the copies of the books in your house, but it's another thing to, you know, to. Anyway, but to totally.
Well, let me ask you that. Is there, though? I mean, again, so for me, what we're talking about is not what the culture thinks of Watchmen. It's not what anyone else thinks about his work other than Moore himself, because I think that is a big part of what A Small Killing is what he thinks his work has come up to this point. And A Small Killing, it's hard to read that isn't a denouncement of what he's done up to that point. And he does throw Watchmen out of his house. He can't have these things in his house anymore because all they do is bring up bad memories.
Yes.
That ultimately, I'm not saying that he thinks that Watchmen's a terrible work. I'm not saying that he thinks, well, he might think The Killing Joke is a terrible work. But he knows that he worked hard on it. He knows that they have value as horror books, as he talks about Necronomicon. But I think at this point in his life, 89, 90, 91, he was trying to make a change. You know, I talk about it as though it's a man having a midlife crisis. I think Alan Moore is having a midlife crisis, or through the version of Timothy, and he's rejecting what he's done before, or at least some of the ways that he's handled it with.
Well, that fits in very well with the stories of him turning 40 and saying, I've got to do something with the time I've got left. I'm going to become a magician, and I'm going to see my work as this sort of, you know, shamanistic whatever, and then actually phoning people and saying that, including Bissett and others, and saying, I want to let you know that this is what I'm doing. So that works in very well. But the only difference between that and what I think is that I think his works were already doing that, whether he was unconsciously doing that or whether he was consciously aware. And I think given how smart and analytical he is, he must have been consciously aware that he was doing that from the get-go. He must have been, just like magic has always been in his work from the get-go, like including those really early Star Wars stories. They're really more like magic-oriented than, I mean, that could have been what he was reading in terms of novels and whatever, rather than real Star Wars stories. But one of the things I was wondering was, we were talking about Tim deciding to not be an advertising person anymore and looking at the want ads at the end of the story, but yet at the same time, it's the fight with the kid that precipitates that ending, where he's like absolutely sure how to carry the flight campaign. You know, the narration says, this is how it will work. There's an old person looking guiltily at Lenin while there's a young kid who's looking forward. So, like, the dream has kind of given him an indication of how to do the advertising campaign. And so, to me, it was like the unlocking of a creative problem, not necessarily deciding to completely abandon that. So what do you make of that? The fact that instead of, you know, him deciding, okay, the solution to this is I just don't do it anymore. Oh, I remember what I wanted to say, and it's in connection to this. I think he felt like he was, or at least he was kind of opening up those capacities to do those kinds of stories with DC. I think it was the reaction that he was sort of not crazy about. The fact that it wasn't really allowing people, or not that it wasn't allowing, it's just that fans were just clamoring for more of the violence, and like even before the Image guys came along, the other people like, you know, independent comics like Kamiko and Eclipse and stuff, they were just kind of pouring on the sex and violence without necessarily the thought or the craft or the pushing the medium towards higher, loftier goals. So to me, like, what do you make of the fact that Tim doesn't say, you know, outright, the solution to this problem is just not to sell this toxic stuff anymore, not to sell Flight, but instead he comes up with a solution for how it's all going to work. Like, everything clicks into place once he decides to confront the kid and deal with the problem.
Well, and absolutely, and I think you touch on something there, which is he comes up with a solution as he's having the fight. It's not the next day. It's before one of them dies that he has this vision on how to do this advertising campaign. And I think you're right. I think, again, going back to the idea that creation, whether it be advertising, whether it being a story, whether it being whatever, you're fighting within yourself, that there's some conflict there. And I think he was having that conflict within himself to come up with that story, come up with that concept. And he has that through the conflict. But then ultimately he doesn't care. I mean, if he's looking at want ads the next day, he's not going to do anything with it.
I guess so. I mean, you make that argument really well. Like, it's hard to really interpret that in any other way now that I look at it. I don't know. I just previously thought that he was just looking at the newspaper, but you're right. He has turned to the situation's vacant. That's not. You know what?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. We should look this up afterwards, but I think situations vacant might also just be like rooms for let, like situation, as opposed to job. It doesn't say, so it might be just that he's staying there for a while, but he might continue to work in advertising. I'm not so sure that.
Yeah, he could very well continue to work in advertising, but he's going to stay there. He's not going on to Russia. He's not going back to New York. He purposely not chooses Flight.
Yeah.
The drink.
Yeah.
I find it very difficult to read that as though he's going to continue to work on the Flight campaign.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I'm not totally convinced, but fair enough. I mean, to me, he could be picking the Vimto over the Flight more because he's acknowledged the kid inside him. Right? The kid says, "Do you really like drinking beer?" You know,
and the answer is apparently no, and Vimto would taste much better.
Vimto's not bad. You should try it.
Is that a real thing?
Oh yeah.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have to try it now. Now I'm going to have to try that. Okay, so I think we discussed a small killing. We discussed. Yeah,
the one thing we didn't really discuss in the small killing is just, I think we should emphasize the metaphors you were talking about. So there's the broken glass with the bird's eggs. There's the embryo. There's the Halibarange bottle with the shards that are broken. And then, of course, there's the kid trying to kill him, these kind of broken shards. And sometimes the storytelling, too, has a kind of broken shard kind of feeling. So I just think that's done really well. Yeah, go ahead. That kind of embryo and, innocence being broken, and, there's the bird and the nest at the end in the pastoral kind of scene you mentioned. So I just think those things are plotted really well. They hold together very tightly, unlike maybe more Lattimore stuff, which is a bit more sprawling, and the symbols don't all kind of click together as neatly, partly because he doesn't want to give you as many easy answers, I suppose. But this stuff is really strong, and it's kind of, the writing is of a kind with the DC stuff, I find, but the material is completely different, which is why it's such an interesting nexus for his work. And I also just want to say that I love the little episode in London with what he calls the alphabet blocks. So those are linked
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
to his alphabet blocks when he was a kid. The buildings, I mean, just the way he captures the atmosphere of London, and the fact that it's really resonant now, because even though they don't look like alphabet blocks, the condos that are going up in Toronto now, and the way it's completely transforming the city that we once knew has already transformed the city that we once knew, is just so uncanny. Just his ability to do that, just like in V for Vendetta, the camcorders and the sense of surveillance that just uncannily resonates throughout time, I just want to say is just incredible, you know?
Yeah. And it harkens to something that I've always noticed about Moore's work and that I've always appreciated is he uses place as another character. So,
yeah,
you know, in Swamp Thing, the swamp was very much alive as a character. In V for Vendetta, that London was very alive as a character. In From Hell, that London is very alive as a character.
Yes.
In A Small Killing, he has these separate locations, and they each have their own flavor and their own character, and these voices in the background, and they feel like a character. They don't feel like any place else. And it's one of the things that he does wonderfully is he imbues these stories with a sense of place, and you know exactly where you are and you feel exactly where you are, and it envelops you into the story.
Yeah. Well put.
If you enjoy comics analysis on deconstructing comics and critiquing comics, or bat discussion on To the Bat polls, support our shows by pledging at patreon.com/deconcomics. Pledge at least $4 a month and you'll get access to our bi-weekly show Spider-Man 1963, a look at the first year of Amazing Spider-Man. Next week's analysis of issue 8 features artist Stephen Bissett's take on Spidey's fight against the living brain. Here's a sample of what our patrons will be listening to.
One thing I wanted to mention, Tim, and I have prior podcasts, have you touched on how a lot of the villains in these comics, you can trace some of them right back to 1950s science fiction horror movies.
Okay.
I mean, the Lizard really is a riff on the 1959 film The Alligator People. It's the same premise. Backwoods scientists, they try to find a cure for amputees to regrow their limb using reptile serums, derived serums of some sort.
Yeah, but it goes horribly wrong.
Exactly. But the closest thing I could think of that the living brain might be kind of derivative of, I mean, even though there were plenty of robots in serials and in 50 science fiction films, the famous one being Robbie the Robot in Forbidden Planet, the closest thing to the living brain is actually a pretty interesting little hard science fiction movie from 1953 called Gog, G-O-G. And it was done as a straightforward, like I said, hard science fiction. There's no monsters or alien invaders in it. It's a straightforward slice of science fiction about early artificial intelligence gone amok. And even the design of Gog, this sort of tank-like robot, in some ways resembles what Ditko did with the living brain. It's got the same kind of hands, and I thought Ditko's design on the living brain is pretty ingenious. It's this weird sort of top-heavy robot on rollers with these swinging battering ram type arms.
If this sounds interesting, please consider pledging at least $4 a month at patreon.com/deconcomics. Now back to the show.
Unless there's anything else you want to add about this book, and if you got a bit of time, I would really love to talk about Jerusalem, because there's really nobody I can talk to about Jerusalem with on the podcast. Nobody who's I think I'm further ahead than you are, unless you've made some significant progress in the last month or two. But
yeah, I'm almost done with book 2. So maybe you should give a brief explanation of Jerusalem, and don't do too much of a synopsis of the plot, or we'll be here all day. But maybe the idea of what book 1 is, what book 2 is, and what book 3 is.
Sure. I'm still in book 3, so I don't completely have an idea of book 3, but I can make a guess as to where it's going.
Sure.
Book 1 is from the point of view of various characters in the Boroughs around this particular night where, well, let's talk about the book first of all. It's sort of like a paean or a love letter to Northampton through time, and it's got these really dense chapters of like 40 pages each or so, 60 pages of just real dense writing that are like immersive into the characters. And like Voice of the Fire, and other works, he tries to draw these connections that sort of set up a 4D kind of sense of time, space, and Northampton and its destiny and its being overlooked by angels. But anyway, it's his attempt to kind of ground Northampton into the center of his universe, the idea that anywhere can really be Jerusalem if you go down deep enough, and then if you give enough credence to the people and the place, as opposed to like selling out for fleeting values and things. So the character that's an analog to him is called Alma Warren, and the family that we kind of get to see the most of are the Warrens, and this is the most autobiographical Moore has ever written, to my knowledge. The Warrens are a stand-in for Moore and his family, and so some of the characters have the same name or a similar name. Some of the characters have slightly changed names. So Moore has been changed into Alma Warren, a female artist who grows up liking the same things he does, has some of the same experiences, but instead of becoming a writer who's really well known, she becomes an artist who's really well known, and she does like comic books and paintings, and she's kind of a local notorious celebrity. Gebby's in there, except she's not the partner, she's the friend of Alma. And then you see like various people, like there's a writer, I'm getting sucked into a plot again, but there's all these people around the Boroughs. It's a kind of a love letter to the Boroughs, and you're building up to the show that Alma Warren's doing, which is based on this sort of like this dream that her brother Mick, who's a stand-in pretty much exactly, I think, for Alan Moore's younger brother Mike, who recounts this whole thing that becomes book 2, which is when he chokes on a sweet, and in real life this happened when he was a kid, and then he survived, even though they had to like get him into a truck and then drive him down to the hospital and blah, 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 blah. But in book 2, Mick experiences what life is like outside our perceived reality. So he goes into Mansoul and this kind of upper level where you can look at all of these different moments in time, and you can encounter the angels, they're called the builders, that kind of look after the place. And he encounters Asmodeus, which is like one of my favorite chapters, where he goes on a ride with Asmodeus and sort of gets tricked. And eventually things are conspired to make him remember what happens when he goes through the corners of the room and up into Mansoul, so that when he's older, he has an accident at work which causes him to remember, and then he tells this to Alma, and then Alma decides to make a series of paintings about it, because Northampton and the state of the world have gotten so bad that she has to do something to try to redress the spiritual balance. The Destructor, which is like this building that kind of destroys all this stuff, has become a symbol of the destruction that's been happening. And, Northampton's often referred to as sort of the center of England geographically, but also spiritually and historically. Although, like Moore does kind of wink at you at the end of book 2 and say, well, if I can't do it, I'll just make it all up, which kind of gives you the sense that, Moore's making up a lot of the stuff. He doesn't actually technically believe in it. And then I'm guessing book 3 ends with the show because, you get sort of more of an abstract reference to things. I haven't really finished book 3, so I shouldn't talk too much about it, except that I am loving it, even though it's been hard going for me. It's taken me a long time to read it, and I've had to fit it in between other things. I love that British sense of poor working class life because it really, really, really reminds me of growing up in England as a kid and, playing and really the best time of my life, even though it was some of the poorest times, just that sense of safety and that sense of whatever that Moore captures, I can totally relate to. Plus, just, I don't know, it's just so rich.
But one of the things that struck me, both in terms of the it's a difficult book to get into. And part of it was probably because I read Voice of the Fire first, and that is a very difficult book to get into. And it's a series of stories about Northampton through the ages. And so I thought Jerusalem was going to be more the same. And it starts off very similar, that here are various points in Northampton's history through different characters and different things happen, and it feels like a series of short stories. And that's book 1 for me. And then that is slow going. I ultimately gave up trying to read the hard copy and just put on the audio edition so I could just listen to it and get immersed into it and force myself to get through it. And then book 2 is completely different. It's a single story told basically in Mansoul, which is stand-in for heaven, if you will, or the angels.
The afterlife.
The afterlife, exactly. And the nice thing about it is, if you are a Moore fan, you're probably going to love book 2. It's funny. The characters are great. There's a bunch of kid ghosts. Maybe they're kids. Maybe they just want to be kids running around the afterlife, having adventures.
Yeah, it's like an Enid Blyton thing. If you know Enid Blyton, she'd do like the Famous Five and I think the Secret Seven, and I read a few of those things when I was a kid in England. Except this one's much more phantasmagoric. It's kind of like Promethea in a sense. It's got all of these like ideological associations that they kind of work their way through, as opposed to the mystery or the plot really driving the thing.
Well, right, but there's adventures. They fight this demon.
Asmodeus,
to get Michael back. They have all kinds of adventures. They get into mischief. They run into, there's the version of a hurricane in the afterlife. It's structured so much easier to read than the rest of it. That I
didn't find that at all. I got to say, I found it was as equally tough going, but but also equally rewarding. But anyway, please continue.
But, I guess where I'm trying to get to is I'm enjoying it. It has a reputation to be difficult to read, and I worry that there are more fans out there who don't necessarily want to pick it up because of that. And I think that they're truly missing on something, because certainly where I am, I'm finishing up book 2. It's been a great story, and I'm curious to see how it's going to relate back to those individual stories, because I think that's what book 3 is about. Is it takes what happens in the second part and brings it back into the individual stories from the first part.
Yes, that is what's happening. There's a little bit more of there's one chapter sort of from the Archangel Michael's perspective, and you see Ernest and kind of the little baby May who dies, his grandchild, on his shoulders as they're walking through the celestial highway kind of thing. But yeah, like to me it's more rewarding than Promethea, and people love Promethea. But for me, just because I don't really know what to make of ritual magic and whatnot, I find that hard to kind of relate to. Just like I find Providence hard to relate to because I am not a Lovecraft fan. Whereas for me, Voice of the Fire and Jerusalem, I can relate to because of my lived time in England. And I don't know if I didn't live there, if I'd grown up in North America all my life, would that just kind of be like baffling and odd? Like, would I think of him as like some kind of, token who'd kind of gone off the boat kind of thing at this point? I don't know, but I'm just finding it very rewarding and I'm very glad that he took that detour from DC Comics, because it's kind of gone to this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it sort of again brings us back to A Small Killing because it's sort of this fulcrum point where things changed. I think there's a lot of Alan Moore fans who kind of wish Moore had never left DC, that he had followed the Grant Morrison career path, if you will, of going from, hey, I wonder what Alan Moore would have done with Aquaman, to I wonder what Alan Moore would have done with Wonder Woman, where, hey, what if Alan Moore had gone over and written X-Men? What would that have been like? And I think A Small Killing answers that question. Moore didn't want to play that game. He was done with that game. He wanted to go off and do something different. And there's this great line, again, this is my area of expertise, is when he was talking about Supreme. He had done Wildcats, he'd done Spawn, and he wasn't quite sure what to make of the Image audience by 95, 96. And he said, those early Image books, he was trying to write to who this new audience was. And by the time Supreme came around, he realized, you know what? That's not my job as a writer. My job is not to figure out what the audience wants. My job is to tell the audience what they want. Moore is not a jukebox. He's not going to press the number and put out a single and you can listen to all your favorite things. He's an artist. He's going to create what he wants to create. And that's what makes his career so interesting, is even with the failures, even with big numbers never being finished, he's doing something interesting. He's going in interesting paths. Who else would have come up with From Hell? Who would have come up with League of Extraordinary Gentlemen?
Nobody. Yeah.
Exactly.
Or Arg. You mentioned Arg before. I have to say, I love that book.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, yeah, I love the first Mirror of Love, the one that he did with Veitch and yeah, exactly. I love that version. I think it's so beautiful. I think it blows the hinges off of the later coffee book he did.
The Villaruba. Yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate the Villaruba one, but it's not comics.
I agree.
That's what's wonderful about that first Mirror of Love is he's taking history and he's taking the afterlife and he's taking this idea of angels and he's mixing them all together to talk about homosexuality. It's wonderful, and he does this, in like 4 pages. It's amazing.
Yeah. And just to go back to your earlier point, like about superheroes, but he did that with Swamp Thing too. He took Dante's Inferno and then he brought that into like Swamp Thing and the Phantom Stranger and Etrigan.
Oh, absolutely.
Like he could have done that with DC, but the thing is, increasingly, I think, like the model of the comics industry has, like, it's the fans and it's the industry. It's not the comics or the superheroes themselves that he's butted heads with. So, like, he was butting heads with Thatcher, right? But I think DC is like the other great nemesis that he's butted heads with and really kind of come on top, if you ask me, although not financially.
Yeah, I think DC might have a different opinion on that as they continue to reprint Watchmen.
And make Doomsday Clock and this and that. Yeah.
Right. Oh. But I think of him. Think of your favorite bands.
Yeah.
The bands that remain relevant, they don't continue to do what they've always done. You know, the next album doesn't sound like the last album. If that's the case, you're just going to have diminishing returns.
Sure.
They go off, they find new sounds, they find new songs, they find new instruments, they find new ways of doing that, and they find new things to talk about. And to me, that's what Moore's career is. He's continuing to go in different directions, and they're not always successful. And you're not going to like them all, but in order to be a true artist, that's what he's got to do. And that's one of the things I really respect about his career, even as, you know, I wish he would finish Halo Jones, even though I know he's not going to.
Yes, I agree. And same thing with Big Numbers. Like, that's never going to be re-released because it was published under his banner, and he's just kind of turned his back on it. And he does that. He turns his back on things. But that in itself is sort of an action of creation and destruction, like you said before. But just to bring it back to Jerusalem, do you like Jerusalem? Are you enjoying reading it? I sense that maybe you're not liking it as much as, and you also mentioned that reading Voice of the Fire was not easy for you. So I find that interesting, whereas like something like Providence, I think you would really like, I'm guessing, whereas I found it, I just found the first issue my favorite, and then after that it was like not as enjoyable.
Well, let's deal with one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So I like Jerusalem. I find it difficult. As I said, I turned to the audio version, which I highly recommend the audio version. It's just...
Who's it read by?
Oh, I don't know. It's a British narrator. I never heard of him before.
Sure.
He's very good, and I like the way I can immerse into it. The problem is I read it, I have often read it when I have free time, and the less free time that I have, the less time I have to listen to it. So as I've done other things on my blog and my comic or whatever, it's gotten so much harder to find the free time to listen to it. So I do enjoy it when I listen to it. It's just it's intermittent when I do.
Right.
As for something like Providence, I don't particularly like Providence. I don't like the structure of Providence. I enjoy Lovecraft. I've discovered Lovecraft through Moore, and I think the Courtyard is wonderful. I think Necronomicon, Neonomicon, is a terrible, horrible, pitch black story that's wonderfully written. It's truly amazing. And Providence feels like you're on the Lovecraft travelogue. Hey, look, now we're in this story. Hey, look, now we're in this story. Hey, look, now we're in this story. And it doesn't feel like it is building into anything. It feels like you're in a series of short stories that ultimately tries to have something at the end that wraps it all up, and it didn't work for me.
Well, that's how I feel about Ladder League stuff. It's just the references game is not satisfying to me, and I don't have the desire to kind of prove my smartness by being able, it's sort of like Pokemon for Alan Moore fans, like get as many as you can kind of thing, and then, get the points kind of thing. And that just is, and it's the people who kind of boast about that, I think, online, that also kind of I find a bit tiresome. But,
that's a fair point. I appreciate them because I appreciate someone finding the references for me.
Yeah, they're doing the work for you. But like you were saying that, like bands that evolve more, tries new things. But do you find he's successfully doing that with Jerusalem or with what have you right now?
Absolutely. I think Jerusalem is interesting. I think it's very good. I think, as I said, I really like Neonomicon when he was doing it. I have liked some of the League. I have not liked some of the League. I find Cinema Purgatorio to be an interesting sort of little side adventure. What he's doing there is truly interesting about, early cinema and its relation to hell, or purgatory. So I think that's interesting. I like that he's taking on these paths. It's been a while since I've loved an Alan Moore book. So, But then again, maybe by the time I finish Jerusalem, I'll be there.
Jerusalem for me is like the Alan Moore book I'm currently loving, and it's already 2 years old or something.
Yeah.
But that for me.
Well, let me ask you about this one, because this is the one that sort of has stuck with me a lot recently. Is Crossed plus 100?
Yeah. I only really read it once, so I don't feel like I really have a huge grasp on it, but continue.
It's the one that has sort of stuck with me that I keep sort of going back to, which is it could have just been a toss-off zombie story, and it certainly has those elements to it. But what it also has is this idea of science fiction and what it means to people and how it creates a sense of hope for the future and what your future is going to look like versus what the present is giving to you, I find to be a ultimately fascinating idea to be mixed with a science fiction zombie story, and ultimately how different people's view of the future and what they hope for and which one's going to win out.
That's interesting.
There's a lot to it. I encourage you to reread it.
Yeah, what I remember just being most affected by was the twist, where they think it's impossible for the zombies to coalesce into a society, but they do, and then there's that kind of bait and switch, and I thought that was like the main kind of idea that Moore was kind of driving at, that kind of arrogance that you have, which I feel like is a common theme in his, and then the horror of kind of discovering that you're wrong. But I can't say it really kind of, moved me in some huge way. But I would like to reread it at some point, just like I'd like to reread everything, really. Even the stuff that I don't like as much. I keep on thinking I should reread the League Nemo stuff, the Johnny Nemo stuff, because I really found that didn't do much for me at the time that I read them, but I gotta give them a go.
Here's an interesting thing that you sort of brought up earlier when we were talking about spoilers. With Moore's work, he often writes twists into his stories, and you sort of catch them on first read, and you're completely taken back by the twist. And if that's all there was, you would never read Moore again. But the reason that certainly I continue to go back to him and read him over and over and over again is all the other things he's doing with theme, with character, with story. And that's why, like when I encourage you to read Crossed plus 100 again, it's because there is that twist. And if you focus on the twist, then it's one story. When you read it again and you start to read more into it, I find that with most of his stories.
No, I totally agree with you. You're preaching to the converted, and I just remember that's like in terms of my memory, and I find as I get older, I don't remember works as well as I used to when I was younger. When I was younger, like, into my 20s, early 30s, I'd read something and then it would, especially a Moore work, it would just be like emblazoned in my mind. So I just don't remember that well. I do remember now that I'm thinking about it that there was a real focus on language. And so that was definitely a big concern of Moore's at the time, and this might be sort of the last work that kind of really deals with that. But the whole thing about, the zombies kind of and their ability to articulate language or fixating on certain things, and so that was kind of like a central concern of the book. I didn't mind it. I just didn't reread it. I also find, like, at this point it takes me a lot longer to read things, so like rereading A Small Killing I found just took me longer than when I had read it back in the 90s and just really discovered it for the first time.
Well, and I think you're right about that. I think, as you get older, it takes longer, and, in your 20s you had the time to, the moment you finished a book, start reading it again.
That too, but I was thinking about why this time around, and this is my theory now. I think that psychologically we're so much heavier. It's as if like our heads are like way more like built up, and not to mention the fact that, we've got other things on our minds. You've got a family, I've got students and high school duties and whatnot. And so the kind of the attention, the fresh attention you're able to give to something, or the capacity you have in your processing hardware that you're able to kind of devote, even though it's the same material and ostensibly the same time it takes to read it, is totally different. So it's not just your perspective that's different, but it's all of the stuff you're carrying around.
Well, and I think that goes to Moore's work as well, in that, he's not who he was in his 30s writing Watchmen. He's now
That's right.
a much older man. He's got a lot more things going on in his head, and his work is probably different because of that. And so maybe it's not as clear. The League is not as crystal clear and easy to follow as a Watchmen is, or one of those. There's a lot more to it, and some people like that, some people don't. He's a different artist now than he was, and he's never going to go back and be that artist, even if he wanted to be, which he doesn't. Yes.
And he's earned the right to do it, and there's no...
Yeah, if not him, then who?
Then who, right, yeah.
Yeah.
A Small Killing is published by Avatar Press. Tell us what you think. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We have a pretty active Facebook group, so please sign up for some interesting comics discussion. Support the show by pledging at patreon.com/deconcomics. Make Amazon purchases at deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. We'd really appreciate it if you gave us a star rating there and a short review. Our theme is from bensound.com. I've been on the road the past few weeks, and next week's episode was all recorded during my visit to Chicago. Next week, we'll remember Chicago comics artist and all-around Renaissance man, Ed Siemiankowicz, who we lost 2 years ago at age 43. Also, pursuant to recent discussion about the comics industry on Critiquing Comics, I visited 3 Chicagoland comics shops and got their takes. Are Marvel and DC on their last legs? We'll ask some retailers next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.